You're listening to Feathers, a podcast of stories about God speaking and his people having just enough faith to believe him and obey. I hope these stories inspire you and encourage you to take flight in your own faith. I'm your host, Amy Bennett, and this is episode 16. Well, hey friends, and welcome back to Feathers. I'm so glad you're here. Today we have something a little bit different than we have been doing. So normally what I do is interview one person and they share their story, but I really felt God wanted me to just stop and just take a look back. We've had 15 interviews now, and it's 2015. I don't know if that's the reason why, but it's a nice matchy number. But I just really felt it was time to kind of step back and look at what we've learned so far about these faith stories and really see if we can kind of summarize things that we've learned so far. And I'm calling this episode Flying Lessons. So this podcast is called Feathers, Faith, and Flight. So we're going to do some flying lessons. And these are not, just hear me, are not my wisdom whatsoever. I feel like what I've done is just kind of mushed everybody's stories together to see what God might have to say to us through these stories, because I don't think they're by accident. I think the right people have come at the right time, and I think God, the whole point is God wants to teach us something and to help us, step forward in faith. So let's talk about, I have 6 things to talk about for today. So the first thing that I want to talk about that I have seen just over and over again is that these ladies have committed their ways to the Lord, that these women are really just after God's heart, after God's way, and that we have to first start there. We have to start with a heart for God. And if we are not seeking him boldly, diligently, we are never going to hear what we're supposed to be faithful in. So I just really think that's the first step, is our posture of our heart, that we have to be committed to the Lord and what he has for us. I know Wendy talked in her story about what disobedience looked like for her. And I think that seeing that evolution of what obedience looks like, and just really seeking after him. And I love the verse she shared, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," from Matthew 5:3. And I think that poor in spirit is really where we start, is a posture in our heart of knowing how much we need Jesus and to live this life, and that his ways really are the right ways. Proverbs 3:6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight." So really that starts with trusting God with all your heart. So we have to first commit our ways to the Lord, and that looks like reading scripture, that looks like listening to his spirit, that looks like praying, that looks like fasting. All of these things are committing our ways to the Lord. So that's the first one, commit your ways to the Lord. All right, the second thing that I think that we can kind of take from this is once we begin hearing from the Lord what our next steps might be, a lot of times it doesn't make sense. I think about Jessie Weaver sharing about her foreclosure. It was something that they would never have planned. I don't know that anybody plans a foreclosure, but it definitely, as she looks back, can see how God used that and allowed that. They wanted to move back with family, and now they didn't get that either, and how that you can see that her parents ended up moving away, and so it wouldn't have even made sense that they moved back home. And so some of these things don't make sense. I think about Melanie when she was talking about it didn't make sense that she was painting. She had never been a painter. She was not the artist. Her son was really the artist. So that didn't really make sense that God was in that. I think about Lizzie when she was kind of leaving the full-time life coaching, how she said that it really didn't make sense to her family why she would leave life coaching. That seemed to be working out really great. She was really good at it. Why would she leave that? But then now with the art studio, it's all making sense how she can fit those two things together. I think about Kathy when she talked about it not making sense to buy a home to flip it when it just had taken her years to sell her farm. That didn't make sense. Hannah, she's, her family sold 90% of everything they had, and they left to go overseas. I know a lot of people would say that doesn't make sense, but God's ways are not our ways, right? I think we just have to realize that. And when we start hearing things from God and they don't make sense, that doesn't mean that is not from God. Proverbs 16:9 says, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. We can make plans and we have a plan of what our life is going to be like, but really it is the Lord who has a plan, and that plan may look, and oftentimes seems to not look anything. I think it comes to mind, Amanda was talking about, she thought she was going to be a full-time traveling evangelist for children her whole life, and that definitely didn't happen, and now she is doing and being able to encourage moms and help teach children from her home as she is with her children. And we just can't have we just don't have the mind of God, and that oftentimes when you begin hearing from God, it may not make sense, but don't let that trip you up. His ways are not our ways, so don't let that stop you. It may not make sense, but we can keep trusting Him. So that's the next step. So once you've committed your way to the Lord, you may start hearing things that maybe in a worldly sense may not make sense. So it may not make sense. Okay, so the third thing that may come up after this is that you experience fear. I heard that and have heard that, have experienced that over and over again, is that you begin experiencing fear. So you hear these things that God begins to whisper to you or shout to you of things that you are going to do. And I believe Satan begins lying to us. And people over and over have said things, what if no one likes it? What if no one likes me? I'm not good enough. This is not good enough. What's going to happen when we don't have a house? What's going to happen when we don't have enough money? There's all these questions that begin to assail us during these times when God has something for us, is that we begin experiencing fear. And I love what Donna Jones shared with us. And she said the act of faith is obeying God even though, and then blank. You filling in the blank is faith really is about obeying Him even though we have these fears. So obeying God even though we may lose everything, even though people may not like me, even if, and the truth is I'm not good enough. But obeying is we have to overcome these fears. Amy talked about the verse in Joshua 1:9. It says, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And that's what I love about this, is that we don't have to fear, because if God has told us to do it, then He is going to be with us. We can be courageous because God is with us. It says He will never leave us or forsake us. We can be courageous because God is with us. Melanie shared 1 John 4:4. It says, you, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. So we may fear the people of the world and what they may think of us and how they're going to judge us. And, from an outside perspective, I think about Hannah, who basically didn't know where she was going to live about 20 different times. And but God is greater. He can overcome any situation. His pleasure means more than any man's pleasure should. We can let go of the fear because God is with us. I talked in one episode about fear for me now is a flag. And it's a flag not to stop something, but it's a flag that probably means that either my flesh or Satan is at work trying to stop me from doing something that is for God's glory, or it's going to be fun or new and exciting. And the fear is just that Satan just trying to stop me. And so I have learned to use fear as a flag to do it, to know that I'm just going to have to do it scared, and maybe the fear isn't going to go away, but I got to do it anyway. And I think about Amanda when she talked about the fear of releasing her second ebook, and how she just, you have to do it anyway. You got to, when God calls you to it, you have to be obedient, and the fear doesn't necessarily go away. You just end up doing it scared, and that's fine. It's really not until I always think about, when I think about that, is a mama bird pushing a baby bird out of the nest. Like you got to jump, and then you'll figure it out on the way down. So don't let fear stop you. So that was the third one, is that you're going to experience fear, but you can push forward. So number 4 is you're only going to get the next step, and you have to take it. And that is what I've seen over and over again, is nobody gets the grand plan laid out on a 6-page essay. God gives you the next step and you got to take it. So sometimes the next step is big. It feels pretty big. It takes a big commitment, but sometimes it's small. So that's where I think it differs a little bit in our stories, is what that next step looks like. So I think of big steps. There's sometimes that we have to do things like renting an art studio and signing that contract. I think about Michelle having to go back to college and spend some time away from her family for a length of time. I think of Sarah having to move away from Scotland to the States. I think of Kathy having to buy a house in order to flip it. Hannah selling everything. Those are, to me, those feel like big things. Those next step, at some point, you have to take that leap, and it's going to feel like a big leap. But sometimes those next steps are small steps. So Natalie talked a lot about a lot of small steps in order to get her book published. I think about, talking with somebody at a conference, writing a proposal, sending an email. Some of these things are small things. I think about Amanda, maybe a small step is just getting a graphic designer for an ebook. Those are small steps that are leading you the way to where you should go. But it's not really the big picture. So, but they're all steps that we need to take in obedience. And I think of Sarah, how she shared about sometimes our step is just to stay put. And I resonate with that personally right now. I think that's where God really has me in a lot of places, is that sometimes, our next step is to go. It's a big thing, but sometimes it's a small thing. And then sometimes our step is really just to stay still. She shared the scripture from Numbers 9:18-22, and I'm going to read this. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in camp. And when the cloud remained over the tabernacles a long time, the Israelites obeyed the Lord's order and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was over the tabernacle only a few days, and at the Lord's command they would encamp, and then at his command they would set out. Sometimes the cloud stayed only from evening till morning. When it lifted in the morning, they set out. Whether by day or night, whenever the cloud lifted, they set out. Whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days or a month or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out. So sometimes, you even hear it in there, sometimes it's every day, every morning they set out, and sometimes they had to sit for a year. And so some of you guys, I feel like, may feel like God is not at work because he's not giving you a direction. But what I have heard, and I believe it was Beth Moore shared it, and I would love to give credit where credit is due. But I think they said, if God is not telling you somewhere new to go, keep being faithful in what you're doing. So sometimes that cloud, just like the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, and that's how the Israelites would know to move. Sometimes we have to be still, and we have to stay faithful in where we are. And that's what Sarah shared about in her episode, about how they really had to stay put for a while. And so that might be your step right now, is just to remain faithful. And sometimes, like we talked about, it might be a big step. You really are going to have to, obedience really does look like, signing a rental agreement for 6 months. Or maybe you just need to send an email. We don't know. So the fourth one is, you only get the next step and you have to take it. So you have to figure out what that next step is, whether it's a big, small, or staying still, and you have to take it. So that's what faith looks like, is actually taking that next step, being obedient. Okay, so number 5 is success is only measured by obedience. So I think a lot of times, and I will even admit to this, when I started out wanting to share stories, faith stories, I really thought everything was going to be tied in a bow. Everybody would be happy at the end. It would be a cool God story that we could share. But what I have learned, and I hope you have heard too, is that sometimes you don't get the happy ending. Sometimes you don't get the cool God story you thought you might, and that's okay. Faith is about being obedient, and we may never understand this side of heaven what success looks like to God. Amanda doesn't have a number that says if her book was successful. Hannah can never really say whether her move to Italy was quote unquote successful. In fact, to some that would even say maybe it looks like a failure. But the truth is that success is not measured by anything in this world. Success is only measured by whether you were obedient or not. So if God tells you to do something and you don't do it, guys, that's disobedience. That is disobedience. And I don't know about you, but I do not want to live a life of disobedience. I think I go back again to Wendy's episode where she was sharing how her life was in disobedience, and it didn't work. It doesn't work when we're in disobedience. And so we find our joy and we find God's pleasure and we find this path by being obedient. And that is success, period. That's the only thing. If we can do all of those next steps, whatever they look like, then we are successful. All right, so number 5 is success is only measured by obedience. We are faithful when we are obedient. And number 6, the last one I want to share that I am just so convinced of, and it's my favorite one, is that God is faithful and can be trusted. We can move forward in confidence. We can move forward with a faithful life. We can be faithful because God is faithful to us. 2 Timothy 2:13 that Sarah shared says, if we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot disown himself. Guys, even when we are disobedient, even if we, don't get it right, even if we don't take that next step, he is still faithful to us. He's so trustworthy. We can take all of these steps because he remains faithful to us no matter what. If God is leading us and we can fly, we can soar with those eagle wings, and he works it all out for our good and his glory. And a lot of times we don't see maybe for years how he works it out, but he does. I think if you would have talked to a lot of these women in the midst of their story, you wouldn't really be convinced that this was a kind of a God story, that they were being faithful, that they were being obedient. I think about how Amanda experienced lots of turmoil in a church setting. And in the moment, that felt so disheartening and so discouraging. And yet that was part of the story of her getting to be able to write those ebooks. I think about Natalie being bullied in school. You want to say, God, where are you? God, where are you? And yet he's able to use that now for her to be able to encourage women in their relationships. So many times I think about Kathy when her house wouldn't sell for years. You have to think, God, where are you? And yet we can see that it was all about God's timing. So many times it really is about his timing. I just think about so many ladies that we've talked to, and that how in the midst of their story, there are some hard times. And yet when they were faithful to God, that years later, in many cases, that they could see how God really was still with them and that he is faithful and that he can be trusted. And many times, when it didn't work out like they thought, it even turned out better in the end, because God knows us the best. God knows the good ways. And the final thing that I'll just share, it's not really a step, but, I just am so encouraged by the fact that these stories that these ladies have shared, it really isn't about the ladies. It's not about how God was making their life great and beautiful. In a lot of cases, it did. That if you talk to them, they have found so much joy and peace in their circumstances. And even through the hard things, they have found God to be such a good God. But in almost every case, God was really positioning them to bring glory to himself and to meet the needs of others in some way. So we really can see when God is at work, when then the outpouring of what we're doing is affecting other people. So let's think about that. If we think about Amanda, and her story was really, the outcome of that was her book and helping parents shepherd their children. I think of Karina and the incredible way that she helps and encourages the women in her life. I think about Amy and how she is meeting the needs in her community with her family. She's teaching her children and meeting the needs around her. I think of our artists, Lizzie, Michelle, and Melanie, who are all using their art to encourage and inspire others. I think of Donna and her husband, how they are now leading a church and shepherding those people. I think about Wendy now with Noonday, how she helps others to adopt and help people across the world in poverty. And so there's so many things that is going on. Really, God's, like we talked about, God's ways are not our ways. God is so busy building a kingdom, and he invites us to be on mission in a million different ways. And we have the privilege to be a part of that. So Our stories are going to look so many different ways, but when we can commit our ways to Him, we begin to take our next steps, we trust Him and move past that fear. God is wanting to invite us in to be part of His army that is building a kingdom. And that's what I so want for all of you that are listening, is that you get to be a part of God's kingdom work. That is what it's all about, and that you personally get to see God at work. It is so exciting to see when you know that God is at work in your life. That's where the joy is, and even when it's hard, because it is hard at times, it is so worth it to look back and see that you know that God was in it. So guys, I hope that helps you. Again, the 6 things that we talked about. One is, first, commit your ways to the Lord. Have that heart of neediness for Him. Be encouraged if it doesn't make sense. Sometimes it's not going to make sense. Number 3 is, you're going to experience fear. You'll likely experience fear, and yet we can overcome because God is with us. Number 4 is, you're only going to get the next step, but you have to take it. Whatever your next step is, recognize what it is, and then be obedient in that. After we take those steps of obedience, we have to recognize that 5th, success is only measured by our obedience. So don't look back and think that you're a failure of some sort. Your success is measured by your obedience. And 6th, finally, is just to remember that God is faithful and can be trusted. And that is why that we can live a life of faith, is because God remains faithful to us. And we are so lucky and so blessed that He chooses us to partner with Him in order to build His kingdom. So guys, I hope that encouraged you and inspired you to be able to just really seek God and just move forward in whatever thing that He's doing in your life. I would love to hear if there are things that are happening in your life, things that you need encouraged in. I would love to pray for you. If you want to hop over to featherspodcast.com, you can get my email over there. It's amyjbennett@gmail.com, or leave me a comment. I would love to hear from you. So thanks so much for hanging with me on these flying lessons, and you guys have a good week. We'll see you next week on Feathers.